Parents who won't admit they're wrong raise depressed children. And I know that's a heavy statement to open with, but we need to talk about this because it's one of the most damaging dynamics that happens in families, and it's way more common than most people realize. So many adults spend years, sometimes decades, carrying wounds from childhood that never got acknowledged, never got validated, never got healed because the people who caused those wounds refused to admit they did anything wrong in the first place. And that refusal, that inability or unwillingness to take responsibility, it doesn't just leave the hurt unresolved, it actually makes it worse. It compounds the original pain with a second layer of damage. This message that says your pain doesn't matter, your experience isn't real, you don't deserve to have your hurt acknowledged. And that's absolutely devastating. This refusal to take responsibility can be devastating for their children because what it does is it takes an old wound and rips it wide open again, while simultaneously confirming the child's worst fears about themselves and about relationships and about whether they're worthy of being heard and validated. From a psychological perspective, this dynamic is deeply damaging, and understanding why requires us to look at both sides of this equation. We need to understand why parents respond this way and what impact that response has on their children. So let's start with the parents, because I think it's important to recognize that this defensiveness, while harmful, usually isn't coming from a place of pure malice. Most parents who refuse to admit their mistakes aren't consciously trying to hurt their children. They're protecting themselves, often unconsciously, from feelings and truths that feel too threatening to face. Parents often refuse to admit their mistakes for two reasons that are deeply intertwined with how they see themselves and their role in the family. First, they fear losing their authority and control in the family. There's this belief, especially in more traditional or authoritarian parenting models, that parents need to maintain a certain image of infallibility to be respected. Admitting fault feels like a threat to their role as the perfect parent, as the authority figure, as the one who knows best. They worry that if they acknowledge they were wrong, if they show vulnerability or admit to having made mistakes, then somehow their children won't respect them anymore, won't listen to them, won't see them as competent or capable. And that fear runs deep because for many people, their identity as a parent is central to how they see themselves, and admitting failure in that role feels like admitting failure as a person. The second reason is that they rationalize their actions to protect their own self-image, convincing themselves that they did nothing wrong. This is where cognitive dissonance comes into play. Cognitive dissonance is this uncomfortable feeling we get when we hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time, like I am a good parent and I hurt my child. Those two thoughts don't sit well together. They create psychological tension, and rather than sit with that discomfort and work through it, rather than acknowledge both truths simultaneously, that you can be a good parent overall and still have done harmful things, many parents resolve the dissonance by rejecting one of those truths, and the one they reject is the one that threatens their self-image. So they convince themselves that they didn't actually do anything wrong, that their child is misremembering, that their child is being too sensitive, that their actions were justified or necessary or not that bad. And once they've constructed this rationalization, once they've built this narrative that protects their ego, challenging it feels like an attack. When their adult child comes to them and says, "This thing you did hurt me," what the parent hears is, "You're a bad parent. You failed. You're a terrible person." Even if that's not what's being said, even if the child is being careful and gentle and just asking for acknowledgement, the parent's defense mechanisms kick in and they can't hear it. They literally cannot process the information because processing it would require them to dismantle the story they've told themselves about who they are. There's also often a generational component here. Many parents who refuse to admit fault grew up in families where emotional expression wasn't allowed, where apologizing was seen as weakness, where admitting mistakes was shameful. They were raised with the belief that parents don't apologize to children, that hierarchy must be maintained at all costs, that showing vulnerability to your kids undermines your authority. So when their own children ask for acknowledgement of hurt, they're not just defending against the specific accusation, they're defending against a lifetime of messages about what it means to be a parent and what it means to be strong. Some parents also struggle with shame that's so deep and so overwhelming that they can't face it. On some level, they might actually know that they hurt their child. They might have moments of awareness, maybe late at night or in quiet moments, where they feel guilt about their parenting. But that guilt is so painful, so intolerable, that they can't let it surface. They can't let themselves fully acknowledge it because if they do, they'll have to face not just what they did, but why why they did it, their own trauma, their own pain, their own failures, and that feels like too much, so they push it down, they deny it, they lash out at anyone who threatens to bring it to the surface. Now, let's talk about what this does to the children, because this is where the real damage happens. When parents won't take responsibility, children internalize the blame. This is almost inevitable, especially if it starts in childhood, but even if it only comes up in adulthood, because children, and even adult children in relation to their parents, are hardwired to trust their parents' version of reality. Parents are supposed to be the mirror that reflects back to children who they are and what their experiences mean. When a parent says, "That didn't happen," or "You're remembering it wrong," or "You're being too sensitive," the child's brain struggles to hold on to their own reality. There's this pull to accept the parent's version because the alternative, believing that your parent is wrong or lying or unable to face the truth, is almost too threatening to a child's sense of security. So what happens instead is the child adjusts their perception. They think, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I am remembering it wrong. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe there is something wrong with me. They grow up believing that they're the problem, that they're unworthy, unlovable, or incapable of healthy relationships. And that internalized blame becomes the lens through which they see everything. Every struggle, every failure, every disappointment gets filtered through this belief that fundamentally, at their core, they're flawed. This self-blame can lead to chronic insecurity, hypersensitivity, and even depression. Because if you believe that you're the problem, if you believe that there's something inherently wrong with you, then of course you're going to feel insecure. Of course you're going to be hypersensitive to any sign that people are disappointed in you or upset with you or thinking badly of you. Of course you're going to struggle with depression because you're carrying around this belief that you're fundamentally defective and unworthy of love. And here's how this plays out in practical terms. For example, at the first sign of conflict in a relationship, they might think, "I'm not good enough for this," or "There's something wrong with me." Someone disagrees with them about where to go for dinner, and their immediate thought is, "They're mad at me. I messed up. I always mess things up. They probably regret being with me." A friend doesn't text back right away, and they spiral into, "I must have said something wrong. They probably don't want to be friends anymore. I'm too much. I'm always too much." A boss gives them constructive feedback, and they hear, "You're incompetent. You're failing. You don't deserve this job." Every interaction becomes confirmation of what they already believe about themselves, which is that they're the problem. They also tend to overfunction in relationships, constantly working to prove their worth, constantly trying to be perfect so that people won't leave them or reject them or confirm what they already fear about themselves. They become hypervigilant to other people's moods and needs, just like they learn to be with their parents, always scanning for signs of displeasure so they can adjust their behavior and avoid conflict or rejection. This is exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting to live this way, to be constantly monitoring and adjusting and performing and proving. Many of these individuals also develop a deep mistrust of their own perceptions and feelings. Because if your parents told you for years that your hurt wasn't real, that your memories were wrong, that your feelings were invalid, then you learn not to trust yourself. You learn to second guess everything. You think, am I overreacting? Am I being too sensitive? Did that actually happen the way I remember it? Maybe I'm making a big deal out of nothing. This self-doubt becomes paralyzing because you can't trust your own read on situations. You can't trust your own feelings, and so you're constantly looking to other people to tell you what's real and what's not, which puts you in a really vulnerable position. Depression is also incredibly common in people who grew up with parents who wouldn't admit fault, because depression is often anger turned inward. When you're a child and you're angry at your parents, but expressing that anger isn't safe or isn't allowed or gets you punished or rejected, where does that anger go? It goes inward. It becomes self-directed. You start attacking yourself instead of the person who actually hurt you. And over years and decades, that pattern of turning your anger and pain inward creates depression. You're essentially doing to yourself what you couldn't do to them, and you're doing it because on some level, you still believe what they told you, which is that you're the problem. There's also often a pattern of choosing relationships that replicate the original dynamic. People who grew up with parents who wouldn't take responsibility often find themselves in romantic relationships or friendships with people who also won't take responsibility, who also gaslight them, who also make them feel like they're crazy or too sensitive or the problem. And this isn't because they're gluttons for punishment or because they're consciously seeking out unhealthy relationships. It's because that dynamic feels familiar. It feels like home. And on an unconscious level, there's often this hope that if they can just get this new person to finally acknowledge their pain, to finally validate their experience, then it'll somehow heal the original wound with their parents. But of course it never does, because you can't heal an
old wound by recreating it with new people. Another thing that happens is these individuals often struggle with boundaries. Because if your parents taught you that your feelings don't matter, that your perceptions aren't valid, that bringing up hurt is wrong or selfish or an attack, then you never learned that it's okay to have boundaries. You never learned that your needs and feelings are legitimate and worthy of being protected. So you let people cross your boundaries, you tolerate treatment that you shouldn't tolerate, and when you do occasionally try to set a boundary, you feel guilty about it. You feel like you're being mean or selfish or difficult. The anxiety that comes from this is also significant. When you grow up believing that any mistake, any flaw, any sign of imperfection could lead to rejection or blame, you become anxious about everything. You overthink, you ruminate, you catastrophize, you play conversations over and over in your head, analyzing every word you said, looking for evidence that you messed up. You have trouble making decisions because you're terrified of making the wrong choice and confirming that you're incompetent or stupid or unworthy. This anxiety is absolutely draining, and it makes life feel much harder than it needs to be. So how do we break this cycle? Because here's the thing, you cannot change your parents. You cannot force them to admit they were wrong. You cannot make them give you the acknowledgement and validation you deserve. Some parents will never be capable of taking responsibility. Some will take it to their graves, insisting that they did nothing wrong, that you're misremembering, that you're being unfair. And as painful as that is, as much as it feels like a rejection of your worth in your experience, accepting this reality is actually the first step toward healing. Breaking this cycle begins with understanding that your parents' inability to admit fault is not your burden to carry. Their denial isn't about you. It's not because your hurt isn't real or valid. It's not because you're being too sensitive or holding grudges. It's about them, their limitations, their wounds, their defense mechanisms, their inability to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. You cannot change them, but you can change how you respond. And changing how you respond starts with separating their issues from your own. You have to recognize where they end and where you begin. Their refusal to acknowledge your pain does not mean your pain isn't real. Their inability to apologize does not mean you don't deserve an apology. Their defensiveness does not mean you were wrong to speak up. Focus on your growth and healing rather than seeking validation from those who may never give it. This is really hard because that validation, that acknowledgement from your parents, it feels like it would fix everything. It feels like if they would just say, "You're right, I hurt you, I'm sorry," then suddenly you'd be healed and whole and the weight would lift. But the truth is, you can heal without their acknowledgement. You can validate your own experience. You can recognize the truth of what happened and the legitimacy of your pain without them ever admitting to it. And while it's not the same as getting that acknowledgement from them, it's actually more powerful because it's not dependent on them changing. It's entirely within your control. Next, practice proper attribution. This means learning to accurately identify what's your responsibility and what isn't. Remind yourself that not every failure is your fault. Many struggles are simply a result of an experience, not a lack of ability. You're learning, you're growing, you're figuring things out. And yes, sometimes you mess up, but messing up doesn't mean there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It means you're human. Start catching yourself when you attribute things to some flaw in your character when really it's just circumstances or lack of experience or someone else's behavior. Affirm your worth and stop attacking yourself for things that were never within your control. This takes practice because the pattern of self-blame is deeply ingrained, but every time you catch it and correct it, you're weakening that pattern and strengthening a new one. Finally, be patient with yourself. If you come from a difficult family background, it's okay if your journey takes longer than others. This is something I really want to emphasize because there's this tendency to look at other people who seem to have their lives together and feel behind or broken or like you should be further along than you are. But here's the thing, while some people were building careers or relationships, you were healing from emotional wounds. While some people had a foundation of security and support that allowed them to focus on external goals, you were trying to build that foundation from scratch in yourself. You were doing the deep internal work of unlearning toxic patterns, learning to trust yourself, learning to set boundaries, learning to believe you're worthy of love. Climbing halfway up the mountain is just as impressive as reaching the top, especially when you had to build the mountain first while other people got to start halfway up. Your progress matters. Your effort matters. The fact that you're here, that you're working on this, that you're trying to heal and grow and and break cycles that have existed in your family for generations, that's enormous. That's worth acknowledging. You are not defined by your past. With time, self-compassion, and the right support, you can rewrite your story and build a life filled with confidence and connection. If this video resonated with you, if you saw yourself in this description, hit that like button and subscribe, because we talk about these kinds of psychological patterns all the time, trying to make sense of how our past shapes us and how we can move forward despite it. Take care of yourself, and remember, your experience matters, even if the people who hurt you can't admit it.